Welcome to Measuring Your Risk Management. My name is Walt Williams, and I'll be spending some time with you in the next 25 to 30 minutes going over how you do exactly that. Let's start out with getting my slides to move forward. The common challenge. So who am I? Or not so much of who am I, but how to reach out to me. As for me, I've done stuff. I've had a 21-year career in information security, preceded by a 15-year career in information technology. So I've done quite a bit. I'm still learning. I'm still having fun. I'm not a hacker, nor do I play one on TV, but I go to DEF CON every year. I can be reached on email, Twitter, LinkedIn, and I do maintain a blog where when I write about information security metrics about once a week. I have two books out, one on how you secure service-oriented architectures. The other is on creating information security program from scratch. That book will be released by CRC Press in September of this year. Neither of them have anything to do with security metrics, however. Quick look at what we're going to be looking at here this day. So what is risk so that you can measure it? Can you learn anything from the standards that we have in this space? How you bring measurements together, the three things you report on when you measure the controls that manage specific risks, and finally, how you get more relevant metrics. So what is risk? You have to know what risk is before you can measure if you're being effective in managing it. And risk is not impact times likelihood. I know a lot of you learned that particular formula when preparing for your CISSP or when reading early drafts of NIST standards. But that's the kind of math that led people to make the decision to put their DR facility in the other tower of the World Trade Center. Because after all, the risk was low because the likelihood was low. It doesn't work that way. Likelihood doesn't modify impact. Impact is impact. If the event's going to happen, that's going to be what the impact is going to be. So risk is the probable frequency and the probable magnitude of future harm. That definition comes from the FAIR standard created by Jack Freund and Jack Jones. They open sourced it, they turned it into the Open FAIR standard. I highly encourage you to read more about this and to learn how to measure risk using the FAIR methodology. That said, Don Parker also challenged our notions that our profession has three pillars: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. He proposed that they were not sufficient, that we also have that we also have utility, control, and authenticity to worry about. And the events of the past 5 years or so have shown us that we also have privacy to worry about. And so there are 7 basic risks that we need to pay attention to. By the way, if you're curious as to the image, that is from the very first Muppet Show episode, and those are the 7 deadly sins. So why do I care about authenticity when I have integrity? Somebody might have challenged Don. Well, you've all seen the supply chain risks that we've been experiencing over the past 6 months or 7 months. Those are attacks against the authenticity of what we are getting from our vendors. And because we have no way of measuring the authenticity of what we're being supplied with by our vendors, we're completely vulnerable to these supply chain attacks. We've all seen ransomware for the past, I guess, 5 years now. Ransomware has been stealing control of our data, and the criminals have been basically extorting us to get back control of our data. We don't have any controls that would prevent it. And so we are completely in their mercy when they breach other defenses. Our controls to ensure confidentiality, integrity, and availability don't protect an attack against the control of the information. Why care about an attack on utility? After all, we keep the data available. Yeah, it can be available and still be useless. Just ask your customer who's gone to your website, tried to use it, and found it too slow to do anything with. Customer will be furious, but you'll be ignorant of this happening because it's not something you're measuring. So, privacy. There are 2 aspects to privacy. One is, has the person's information been leaked? That's your data breach, and you think that controls against confidentiality are sufficient. However, there is another aspect to privacy. Can you identify the person who used your system from the data that they left behind? their IP addresses, the MAC addresses, the date and time stamp for the IP address and the MAC address, or just with the IP address, might be enough to identify who it was that used your system at that particular moment. That's a breach of privacy. Unauthorized access to your logs is a breach of privacy. And the problem is that you have no controls to prevent it other than restricting access to your log tables. And the fact that you're collecting logs at all is problematic. So, understanding what controls protect what. Well, let's take a look at our standards. First, NIST breaks things down into, can you identify, detect, protect, respond, and recover from something? They're basically talking about from events, and those events really, the controls around those events really don't help you much in terms of helping you understand what you're doing to prevent unauthorized changes to your data. When the CIS-CSE gives you 18 controls, they don't really help you understand how you keep things up and running. There's nothing in their control catalog about availability. Yes, they'll say, okay, we have a section on how we recover from a disaster, barely, but not how you keep things up and running as load increases. So too much of our orientation in our standards, PCI DSS, I'm looking right at you, are all about protecting confidentiality. And we give kind of lip service to protecting availability and integrity. And we tend to, in our professional lives, forget about the rest of it to our detriment. Now, we understand what risk is, but this talk is not about risk. It's a talk about how you measure the controls used to manage risk. It's about knowing if those controls are effective. Let's dive into that now. Now, there are standards that define how you look at metrics. 27.4, CIS-CSC 7, 8 will have its metrics out soon. NIST SP 800-55, Rev 1, and of course the CSA Star Alliance. They're developing their metrics. They will be released shortly. 27.4 gives you 68 pages of how you create measurements and some 35 candidate measurements to use. And they propose two kinds of measurements against whether or not you've completely rolled out the control and if it's being effective. SP 855, in their 80-page document with 19 candidate metrics, defines a third metric. Is your control having an adverse impact? As for the Center for Internet Security, they only look at one thing in their 24-page guide. Though they have 177 metrics, it's all about completeness. Every single person I'm virtually talking to has deployed anti-malware software to 100% of their systems, I'm imagining, and still had malware come through. That's because being effective is not being complete, despite what the Center for Internet Security would argue. And so we need to look past what they offer in terms of, are we being effective in what we're doing? So again, from NIST SP 855, there are three things we need to measure and report on. Is the control effective? Check. Is the control completely deployed? Check. And if it's not, it's certainly not going to be effective. Is the control having an adverse impact? And that's an extremely important thing for us to measure, report on, and be aware of. It's certainly something that the business is aware of. Completeness. The CIS is correct. You have to have your controls fully deployed to give them a chance of being effective. Of course, having them fully deployed will mean that they will have the greatest adverse impact if they're going to have an adverse impact. But we should start here. And all we really have to do is count, compare what is done to what isn't. So you have a percent complete as an excellent metric. 27.4 is excellent in helping us get past measurement to an understanding of a metric. Because a metric is not a measurement. A metric is an analysis of multiple measurements to look at where your desired state is. And they provide indicators of success or failure. And when taken over time, it gives you a trend for your analysis of your current state against the desired state. So the metrics are designed to create a way to measure difference between reality and your goals. So you take your different attributes, whether or not they're coming from the firewall, from the SIEM, from wherever, and you come up with a way of measuring what that control is doing. You pull the data out, and that's your base measurement. And then you do some analysis of that to get to a derived measurement. You combine that with attributes from other controls in order to do some analysis. So each one of your controls will spit out multiple data sets, and you bring those together to get your measurement function and your derived measurement. And then when you have those from each of your controls, you bring them together to do some analysis to give you an indicator. Are things working? Are things not working? Are you having an impact or not? And that indicator can then be interpreted against your goals to see how well you're doing. And then you can report on it. The big question that all those standards ask is, who's doing the analysis? Who's doing the collection? Does data come out from the tool automatically? Probably not, even though the tool is generating data automatically. Can the data be exported to a format that can then be analyzed? And if so, who's doing that? Is that happening automatically, or is that happening because somebody is going in there on a periodic basis and pulling data out into a format that can be analyzed? And is that analysis being done by a person with a spreadsheet, or have you written some software that will do that analysis for you? These are important questions that you have to answer within your own program. Now, setting goals. Excuse me a moment. In order to know if you're being effective, you have to have goals. So one goal can be to reduce impact. One goal can be to reduce event frequency. One goal can be to be completely deployed. Now, when you're reducing impact, you're actually reducing the material risk. When you reduce event frequency, you're reducing how often you experience material risk. And most of our controls are designed around reducing how often things happen, not how impactful they are. That, after all, is what a preventative control does. So they're not really reducing risk. They're reducing the amount of times we experience it. And it's important to understand that. Now, Windschwartz likes to define effective security as a time-bound problem. How quickly you respond and stop an attack directly relates to how bad the impact is. So you have a metric of time to detect plus time to react. Very, very simple metric, but you have to understand that you want to track this over time, and there are bounds to it. There's a lower bound and there's an upper bound. And your lower bound is measured in compute cycles on your computer. So you've got essentially your time to detect plus time to react is going to be at least, if not greater than, 2 compute cycles. And all your controls designed to protect confidentiality do is increase the time to detect through slowing down the attack, which is a good thing, by the way. Don't want to put that down. Now let's construct a meaningful metric, and we'll use a data breach because that's something where most people are familiar with. We have the Verus database that we can use to take a look at historical analysis and see that account theft through a successful phishing campaign has become the most common cause of a data breach over the past few years. So our threat scenario is very simple. The risk is a compromise of confidentiality, and the scenario is that this is done through the compromise of credentials of an account that had access legitimately because the holder of that account clicked on a link that stole their credentials. So let's look at the controls that we'd be measuring, the controls designed to prevent this. So we have spam filtering, which is a preventative, as is URL filtering and DNS filtering. We have, hopefully, multi-factor authentication in place to provide stronger credentials harder to steal, depending upon the multiple factors in use. We have user behavior analytics into what the user usually does or doesn't do, perhaps some machine learning on that. We have, of course, our firewall rules to control access to things. Those all reduce event frequency. To reduce impact, we have our source destination bandwidth management, where we shrink the amount of bandwidth going to an unknown source or an unauthorized source. We have our seams and our sores, or our NDRs, designed to put a stop to things that are not supposed to be happening. And of course, we have DLP, if you've been so bold to deploy it and configure it, whose goal is designed to prevent data from being written to an unauthorized source. So those are the potential controls designed to protect this specific kind of risk. If you had a different scenario for a compromise of confidentiality, the controls would be different. Setting up goals for these things, you want to set your goals for the best case scenario so that you have 0 phishes that are delivered ever. You have 0 bad URLs clicked. I know Nirvana. You have 0 bad hosts that are reached. You have multi-factor authentication that has 0 unauthorized connections from unknown hosts. You have user behavior where 0 actions deviate from your historical trends. You have a goal for your bandwidth management that you reduce bandwidth to any unknown host to slow things down. You have a goal for your firewall that you have 0 connections to your unknown hosts. Your DLP that no data is written to unknown hosts. And of course, with your SIEM and your SOAR or your NDR, that anything that got past all of the above is detected 100% of the time and responded to in a timely fashion. Those should be your goals, and you're going to measure reality against that, and those are your measurements. You're measuring the frequency of events, and when an event happens, you're measuring how long does that event happen for. And because you have controls that do both preventative and a detective, you need to report on both how frequently are things happening, how long do they endure for, and thus measure how effective your risk management is. Now, with each one of those controls, they can have an adverse impact, and you're going to want to have goals for that and report on the deviations for that too. With your spam filtering, you want to block 0 legitimate emails. With your URL filtering, you want to block nothing that's legitimate. With your DNS filtering, you want all the legitimate hosts to be accessed. With your multi-factor authentication, you always want the authorized people to get access. You want to ensure with your user behavior that 100% of normative behavior is permitted, that there's no bandwidth reduction to authorized and known hosts, that 100% of legitimate traffic gets through your firewall, and that all your data is written as it should be to known and authorized hosts. And finally, of course, with your SIEM and your SOAR or your NDR, that there's no unauthorized access to your logs. And if so, you've had a breach of privacy. Analysis. Things that you can do to look at the data and not just measure raw numbers. Look at the standard deviation from the norm. That's going to tell you something often more important than what the norm is. How much things vary from that norm is a very good measurement of whether or not it's being effective. Look at the percentage of your controls that are more than a percentage from their goals. Again, a very, very useful way of looking at the delta between reality and the ideal. Now, are the trends of both of those heading in the right direction? Are the standard deviations from the norm getting smaller? Or is the percentage of controls more than that 5%? And you could set that wherever percentage you want it to be, heading in the right direction. And please use the measurements from one control to measure the effectiveness of another. You can use clicks on URL filtering as an example to measure how effective your security awareness training is. You can use how often people get to unauthorized hosts in your URL filtering to measure how often, or sorry, how effective your DNS filtering is. So success in one control can be measured through the numbers from another control, and that's another kind of analysis you can and should do. Finally, reporting. As you have different controls implemented for each threat scenario, your algorithms need to be specific for that threat scenario. So as you pull together controls regarding phishing, those are going to be a different set of controls designed around, oh, I don't know, malware. They're going to be related because some malware comes through phishing, but not all malware does. Um, and you're going to want to report on if the controls in scope for a specific threat scenario are operating effectively without adverse impact for that threat scenario. Now, is that enough? No, it's not enough. It's never enough. You should know whether or not your measurements are pragmatic. One of the insights that Gary Hinson and W. Craig Rothbury had is that you want to know how good your measurements are. And they developed a scale using the pragmatic framework for understanding if your measurements are pragmatic. So is it predictive? Can you see the future from looking at the past? Are they relevant? Sometimes the number is not relevant to the risk scenario that you're looking at. So why are you bothering to track it? Is it actionable? Can you do something about it? Or are you reporting on something just for the sake of, I'm reporting numbers, aren't I great? Is it genuine? Sometimes your analysts will fudge the numbers. Is it meaningful? Does the number tell a story? As a great example of numbers that tell no story is how many port scans have you blocked today? Well, who cares? And it's certainly not actionable. Are the numbers accurate? Sometimes you will find that your systems, when they give you exports, fudge the numbers. There was a web application firewall that used to stop logging when it was under attack. And I never understood that because that meant you would never be able to react properly if something got through. It used to drive me crazy. I'm not using that, and I'm not going to tell you who it was either. Catch me under an NDA and I'll be happy to disclose it. Is the information timely? Well, can you get the information quickly enough to act on it? That's kind of important. Doesn't matter who's doing the analysis. Can you get different people to pull the data together and get the same results? And finally, is it cost effective to pull this data in, do the analysis, and get the results that you need? Now, if the results are who cares, why are you tracking it? If you are not going to get action from this, don't bother. Only track metrics that give you results you're going to act on. If bad results are shown and people don't do anything about it, that's a metric in and of itself, in a way, isn't it? Now, not all metrics are for all people. Certain metrics you're going to want to report to your staff for them to take action. Others you'll want to report to your peers because they are the people who need to act on it. Some metrics need to be reported up to senior management so that they can be aware of how things are going in the environment or take action if their underlings are not doing something. And finally, the metrics you report to the board. What is your risk? And on a high level, how are you doing in managing it? You can learn more. There's the securitymetrics.org is a great community, comes together periodically. I've obviously been part of it for a number of years. The Society of Information Security Risk is another great community. They're about to have their annual conference, unfortunately at the same time that DEF CON is happening, but do get involved with both of those communities. There are some great books out there. I highly recommend Andrew Jacquis, Security Metrics, George Campbell's Measures and Metrics in Corporate Security. Catherine Wong's Security Metrics, A Beginner's Guide is a great place to start. Taking a look at Douglas Hubbard's and Richard Searson's How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk is a brilliant book. By the way, Richard Searson's got a new book coming out, The Metrics Manifesto. Please, when that comes out, buy it, read it. He's brilliant and well worth paying attention to. Pragmatic Security Metrics is an excellent resource. I refer to it all the time so that I know that what I'm doing is making better sense. Win Schwartau, thank you for Analog Network Security. It's an absolutely brilliantly written, brilliantly illustrated book. Jack Jones and Jack Freund, thank you, thank you, thank you for your work in measuring and managing information security risk. You can often get that book for free. Please get it, read it, come to an understanding of all of this. And if you need to reach out or to want to reach out to me about any of this, please feel free to do so. Email. I'm on Gmail, Twitter. I'm there periodically. Feel free to link into me. No, not if you're a salesperson. I'm not open to that. I do maintain a blog where I write about information security metrics on a periodic, usually on a weekly basis. Right now, I'm doing a series on measuring cloud security. I want to thank you for your time today. I wish you all the best. Get involved, start measuring, and have a great future. Bye-bye.